If you identify people based on their actual talent for leaders, you will actually have more women than men in leadership roles, because all the science suggests that on the qualities that actually matter, empathy, self-awareness, transformational leadership, EQ, humility, women score higher than men.
That's Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic, psychologist, author, and entrepreneur. Currently the chief talent scientist at Manpower. I'm Alison, organization psychologist, CEO, and endurance athlete. I've spent the last 25 years helping companies solve the people and organizational challenges of growth. I've worked with all types of CEOs and business leaders across the world, but it takes a special type of leader to successfully grow a business. I call them growth leaders. These leaders have an edge for growth. This allows them to drive performance today while transforming their business for tomorrow and still keeping their people energized. Growthleaders is my new podcast where I'll show you what it takes to successfully lead business growth in conversations with some of the best growth leaders I know. Tomas, it's great to have you here on my podcast, Growthleaders.
It's good to be here.
So, usually I'm interviewing these growth leaders. You're like a 2-for-1 because you also are a growth leader and you're a world-class expert in human behavior and leadership and personality. So I'm super excited to talk with you today.
Well, thanks again for inviting me. And at least I'd like to say that at least in my own mind, I'm an expert of people issues. I'm not sure if that opinion is shared, but I do my best.
So you have to answer the first question that I always ask everybody, which is, what was your first job?
So I think, it's either cleaning swimming pools or cutting grass in my aunt's kind of a neighborhood who lived just outside the city of Buenos Aires. Mm-hmm. And most weekends when I used to be, I think, around 10, 11 years old, I would just try to kind of monetize time doing either of those things. So yeah, I can't remember which one came first. It's probably depending on demand, but one of those two.
Awesome. Well, that's a great start. She said, while you were cleaning pools, I was delivering newspapers.
There you go.
But I ate all my profits, so it was not a good beginning. I'm so excited to talk with you about your book that's going to be published. I guess it's in March 2019. Great title. Why do so many incompetent men become leaders and how to fix it? Tell me, what is this book about?
So in a nutshell, it argues that, one of the major reasons for the poor representation of women in leadership roles is that there are insufficient obstacles for incompetent men who want to become leaders. And so if we want to both improve the quality of our leaders and the representation of women in leadership roles, what we should do is focus on talent or potential properly, use data and science-driven tools, distrust our intuition, and that there isn't a tension or a compromise between the two. If you identify people based on their actual talent for leaders, you will actually have more women than men in leadership roles, because all the science suggests that on the qualities that actually matter, empathy, self-awareness, transformational leadership, EQ, humility, women score higher than men. So I like to think that it's a data-driven case for feminism.
Well, and it sounds like maybe we need more barriers strategically placed.
Exactly.
My organization thinks a lot about growth leadership, and we think about 3 dimensions to that. The ability to drive the business to perform, the ability to transform for the future, and the ability to energize people for both of those, and to not burn everybody out in the pursuit of the performing and the transforming. So I'm curious to hear your views about, if you think about those dimensions, and it's quite consistent with the research around the exploit and explore aspects of growth. Are there differences between men and women in those aspects?
Yeah, so, we don't have that many large-scale and, representative studies that actually evaluate gender differences in growth leadership, mostly because I think, it's a novel construct. You have to look for close enough alternatives to the leadership style that enables those 3 kind of key components of growth leadership. And I think the best place to start is examining the meta-analysis on gender differences in transformational leadership, because transformational leadership really enables these things more than transactional or other forms of leadership. And what that research shows very clearly is that women tend to score higher. It's not a huge difference, but there is a difference of maybe 10, 15, up to 20% on different elements of transformational leadership, like managing talent, rewarding actual performance, objectively evaluating potential, and especially mobilizing people's beliefs and systems of values. And what's interesting is that we tend to assume that the leader that enables this tends to be, a very charismatic, loud, bold, flamboyant person, and actually that's not at all the case. It's often people who are much more discreet, humble, and low-key who have this transformational impact on others.
Well, and that's certainly what I hear in my podcast on growth leaders. I hear that over and over again. And I always love that, because these growth leaders they've done tremendous things, but they're always humble about it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. It's kind of ironic.
Well, it seems now that ever since Jim Collins published his famous book From Good to Great, we habituated to saying, or at least paying lip service to the idea that humility is really important, but then it's not reflected in most of our choices for leaders. So we say we want one thing, but actually we pick the other.
I think so often we have leadership models that encourage behavior that might be more arrogant, and that calls attention to oneself, which I really think is not what you see in growth leaders.
Exactly.
So what are some of the things that you suggest in your book about how to fix this issue?
So the first is to really distrust our instincts. And I think as kind of an organizational psychologist, trying to help organizations have a more data-driven approach to decisions or managing talent, I always say people's intuitions or their instincts are our biggest enemy, because even if they pretend to believe you or they believe what you're saying, at the end of the day, there will be a time or point when the information provided by an assessment, by some data, by some objective metrics will challenge their own gut feeling. And 90% of the times, people will rather do what their gut feeling tells them. So it can be a very, very simple thing. Like you have two candidates for a leadership role, you interview one of them and you really like them. They seem to have great culture fit. They're funny, or you got along with them and you see, wow, they have a lot of potential. And then that person scores very low on some measure of objective potential. And then you have the reverse, somebody who does poorly on an interview but has a great profile. And more often than not, even when we believe that these tools are data-driven, etc., we will trust our instincts, our intuition. I mean, that's the main one. The second will be follow the science. There's at least 50 and probably more 100 years of evidence of what makes a good leader, and yet we ignore it when it comes to making decisions. And then the third one is, even if your objective is just from a kind of a social fairness perspective, increase the number of women in leadership, you shouldn't do this by making it easier for women, lifting some barriers for women to become leaders, but actually by increasing the barriers that are currently in place for men. So apply the same standards that you apply in selecting women leaders to male leaders, and the system, the process will improve systematically.
I've certainly seen research that shows amongst even high potentials, women will have to perform 3 times higher to get the same performance rating than a man.
Exactly. And then, the solution is not to make it easier for women, but actually make it as hard for men. It's like, if women are outperforming men in actual measures of leadership, that's because our selection criteria there are better.
Now, I want to ask you about sort of a different area of research, because I know if you look at areas like leading innovation, developing external relationships, and being politically savvy, those are areas where women often don't score as well as men, and they're important for growth. So what's your view about that?
I agree, that is the case, but I think there's definitely the issue, I think, is that there is quite a bit of noise in the outcome measures, because when you have people evaluating whether somebody has been innovative or not, and they apply different criteria to judging the performance of a man and a woman, you are predicting an outcome that isn't objective in the first place. I mean, maybe the more extreme and clear evidence of this comes when boards increase the percentage or representation of women leaders, right? So companies elect more women to boards, and then that automatically has a negative impact on the stock price or valuation of the company. Why? Because the market is influenced by people's perceptions, not by, and if you just looked at the data, you would say, okay, so it's bad to have women with more, boards with more women. Well, perceptions drive reality. And unless you change the perceptions, or at least you have measures of performance that are independent of people's stereotypes and their perceptions, you won't have that, you know? The research on entrepreneurship, for example, indicates very clearly that although it's a lot harder for women to get funding from VCs, private equities, angels, etc., so funding in general for their enterprises, they are more successful once they get it. The ROI of, you know, every dollar that you invest in a male-founded or female-founded company favors women.
But is that because it's so much, they have to be so much better in order to be able to get the funding?
Partly, yes. And again, you know, then the solution is, well, why don't we apply those same parameters or standards? But even if you did that, actually, there will be a higher proportion of women with the qualities you want than men.
Now, there's an idea that I've read about called the glass cliff, which suggests that when times are tough or an organization is not doing well, that the organization is more likely to put a woman in charge. Is that true?
So I don't know that there's enough large, you know, quantitative studies to see if this happens in general, but we do have examples, right, from Marissa Mayer at Yahoo, and then, you know, there's always specific case studies that at least are used to illustrate the point. And I think it is a valid point. It is a valid point. If you're setting up people for failure, which we know happens and has happened throughout history, then, you know, this could potentially give organizations an excuse to pretend that they are doing, you know, they're being more kind of egalitarian, and that they don't have any prejudices or biases against gender, while at the same time make the point they want to make, that you see, oh, you wanted a woman, we have one, and now she failed, you know? So it's very sad because these very prominent case studies perpetuate people's, you know, negative attitudes towards women.
Now, we looked at some research by David Day, and one of the things that David talks about is the importance of identity as a leader, and that's important for progression, is to see oneself. How can organizations help women build an identity as a growth leader?
So, you know, I think it's important first to do it in the cases where there is some potential, right? And where there's even interest or the willingness to be a growth leader. So identifying the right candidates is a good starting point. Then I think it's important to educate leaders about the concept, because most leaders, unfortunately, don't understand, you know, what it means to be at least this idea of a growth leader. Even when they are, they might not be aware of it, you know. So you raise awareness by helping people understand this is a specific type of leadership, this is how we define it, etc. And I think the third one is just ongoing, constant feedback on their performance by mentors and experts, so that they can really understand the why and what aspects of their behavior are contributing to growth.
I think that's great advice. Tell me a little bit more about what the actual criteria are for selecting a leader, and why does this impact women?
Yeah, I think, you know, first of all, it's important to understand that they are pretty toxic.
The criteria are toxic.
Yeah, the criteria are toxic.
Say more about that.
I think there is almost like a toxic mismatch, I would say, between the things that help people get promoted into leadership positions and the things they need to actually have in order to be good leaders, you know? So the criteria that are in place, I would highlight three, which is what I cover in my book. First, we look much more for confidence than competence, which is why we over-rely on interviews or short-term displays of bravado, assertiveness, tend to beat hard data. And competence should not be that difficult to evaluate. And yet we make decisions based on 5 or 10 minutes as to whether somebody deserves the leadership role or not. Secondly, we're much more likely to look at charisma as a key marker or indicator of leadership potential than humility. And again, in theory, we say, humility is very important, but most of the times we really want leaders who are entertaining and look more like stand-up comedians than people who can actually transform teams and turn a group of individuals into a high-performing unit. And charisma doesn't help you do that. Once the entertainment instance or window has passed, you have to actually know what you're doing. And the third thing is a preference for individuals who are self-centered, self-focused, quite narcissistic really, as opposed to other-oriented and altruistic, and that really has implications for the level of integrity that leaders have, So if we could pick people on the basis of their competence, their humility, and their integrity, things would improve a lot. Instead, if you look at overconfident people, narcissistic individuals, and charismatic people who are often quite psychopathic, all these things that are bad for leadership are over-indexed. And on these things, men score higher than women. So both things are confounded. These negative qualities that we reward when we shouldn't because they impair leaders' performance also contribute to the overrepresentation of male leaders.
Well, it's very interesting because you're talking about this in the context of men and women. We see the same dynamic of Asians and Westerners. And so the same thing that you're talking about that impacts women in a negative way, we find also impacts Asians in a negative way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, although globalization tends to erode some of the cultural preferences or differences that make up, the people do become more similar in their expectations. So we value charisma, confidence, and even bravado or dominance everywhere. It is true that it happens much more in the Western world than in Asian countries, and for example, that there is much more of a true emphasis on humility in Asia than in America. I mean, even if you compare the UK and America, which are very, very similar countries, you can see, in one place, you're expected to show a certain level of self-love, self-belief, and confidence, or you are regarded, as a loser. I mean, the fact that somebody that a book can become a bestseller by pointing out that it's okay to be introverted, only in America can this be a controversial statement, And in other and in Britain, the people have developed an incredible ability to even fakely self-deprecate, and so you don't even have to go to Asia versus the Western world. Even comparing two countries that are very similar, you can see the impact of culture.
In addition to being an expert on human behavior and a psychologist, you've also held very senior leadership positions, including CEO of Hogan Assessments. Now, what have you learned as a leader that's leading growth that has helped you or hindered you?
I think it's at least for me, it has been a constant journey of self-discovery, because you learn so much about yourself when you are in any leadership role. I think even more junior and earlier kind of leadership or even management roles, you have to learn to manage your reputation all the time. You have to understand that you're an example to others, and that there are things that you might be impulsively inclined to do that you need to kind of contain, because other people basically are looking up to you and want to follow, expect you to be a role model, and of course, even people who are talented and maybe in the right role and knowledgeable have weaknesses that are impossible to hide, So I think still making an effort to maintain a positive image to inspire others is very important. And then I think the last one that I would say is that no matter how smart your colleagues and your clients or your coworkers are, and no matter how rational you try to be in kind of negotiating with them and influencing them, people are creatures of emotion first, and that applies as much to you as to others. So the main kind of gap that I've always had to do, coming from a kind of more academic and perhaps less emotional environment into the real world of business, has been to understand that you connect with people or not so much based on logical arguments and kind of a reason, but as much or more through emotions, so being kind of really try to tune in to the emotional mindset of others is something that you can't learn even as a psychologist in book, and you can't learn through your research. You learn by doing. And so I like to think that in combination, these things have sort of at least improved somewhat my EQ or my emotional intelligence. Maybe not that much, because that's not possible, but much like my Uber rating has improved from 4.6 to 4.8 after repeatedly trying to be very nice and not let drivers work. I think maybe in the 10 years that I've been a leader, I've managed similar kind of 20%.
Right. But I think that's a really great example of how we all come with weaknesses, and that it takes awareness, it takes discipline and practice to try to address those. And that's certainly one that's got to be on one of the harder ones for people to develop.
Exactly. And I think it's this kind of a dual challenge almost of simultaneously, try to mitigate or at least hide your weaknesses while being aware of them so that you correct them. It's kind of this, as opposed to being in denial by them and making them very obvious.
Exactly. It's interesting. So Marshall Goldsmith wrote the opening for my book. And he has this saying that I love about that. He talks about people's excessive need to be themselves. And I love that because, nowadays everyone likes to talk about how authentic you have to be. And what I'm hearing you say is, well, maybe you don't have to be so authentic.
Oh, yeah.
And say more about that.
And I didn't know that he had that line, but I often use the line that, you have to earn the right to be yourself, and that probably the real you is someone that 3 or 5 people in your life have learned to love or at least tolerate. And that, of course, we're not saying that you should be inauthentic in your behavior to the point of going against your values or being a fraud or an impostor. But I think that anybody who attained a certain level of success in what they do pays a lot of attention to how they are perceived and really regulates their behavior in social situations. So in a way it is the opposite of being your natural you or authentic or just removing social inhibitions from your behavior. I think civilization is largely the result of putting more and more effective censorship in place to people's natural selves. Of course, it can be taxing if it's taken too far and if people are feeling repressed or so constrained but all we want is a certain etiquette and awareness of how your behavior impacts others. And that does require you to self-monitor and do things that are to some degree unnatural. They might still become habits, right? But that still comes with working on yourself.
Yeah, I guess that's the key, is to create the right habits that make it easier to be your best self.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Tomas.
Thank you.
Many thanks to Tomas for joining me on this episode of Growthleaders. You can find his new book, Why So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders and How to Fix It, on Amazon. In the next episode of Growthleaders, I'll be talking to Julie Tay, who heads up Align Technologies, famous for its Invisalign and visible dental braces. I'm Alison Eyring. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to Growthleaders wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a comment and a rating. We'd love to hear what you think.